There is a family in California worth more than $7 billion combined. They own one of the most beloved fast food chains in America, a company with only a few hundred locations that somehow generates more devotion per restaurant than almost any competitor on earth. They have refused to franchise for over 75 years. No investors, no public stock, no expansion for the sake of expansion. This is the story of a young couple who opened a 10-foot wide hamburger stand across the street from a high school in 1948, and how that stand grew into an empire, even while the family behind it endured a plane crash, an overdose, and a bitter inheritance battle. It is the story of a granddaughter who lost her father at 17 and somehow ended up running the entire company before she turned 30. This all started in a tiny Los Angeles suburb called Baldwin Park, with a couple who had almost nothing but a $5,000 loan and a two-way speaker box. Harry Snyder was born on September 9, 1913 in Vancouver to Dutch immigrant parents who later settled in Seattle and then Santa Monica. He worked odd jobs throughout his youth to help support his family, and during World War II, a perforated eardrum kept him out of combat and stuck behind a desk in the Navy. After the war, he worked as a caterer, delivering boxed lunches to a military base in Seattle. And that job is where he met a recent college graduate named Esther Johnson, who had served during the war as a Navy nurse and was working as a restaurant manager at the same base. The two married quickly and moved to Southern California, drawn by the booming post-war population and the endless stream of new families settling into the region. They landed in Baldwin Park, a small rural town filled with cattle ranches and modest houses near the growing highway system. On October 22, 1948, Harry and Esther opened their first hamburger stand at the corner of Francisquito and Garvey Avenue, a tiny building barely 10 feet square, sitting directly across the street from Harry's childhood home. The stand was an immediate hit. In its first month alone, the couple sold roughly 2,000 hamburgers, cooked and served by nobody but the two of them. Harry ran the grill and Esther kept the books, and together they built something that looked nothing like the drive-in restaurants already popular across the region. What made their tiny stand different was not just the food, but a piece of equipment nobody else in the state was using yet. At the time, most drive-in restaurants across California relied on car hops, employees who walked out to parked cars to take orders and deliver food on trays. Harry had a different idea. He installed a two-way speaker system at the front of the gravel driveway leading up to the stand, allowing customers to place their order from inside their car without a car hop ever walking over. It is widely considered the first drive-through ordering system of its kind in California, years before drive-thrus became a fixture of American fast food. Harry was obsessive about ingredient quality in a way that stood apart from nearly every other burger stand of the era. He refused to use frozen meat, insisting on fresh beef patties hand-formed daily. And he wanted produce that had been picked and prepared as close to serving time as possible. His nephew later recalled that Harry wanted to take the lettuce straight off the ground and the tomato straight off the vine, preparing the burger fresh in that exact moment, rather than stockpiling ingredients ahead of time. The stand grew slowly and deliberately, since Harry and Esther refused to borrow money on credit and refused to franchise the concept out to other operators. By the mid-1950s, the chain had grown to 6 locations across the Los Angeles area, still entirely owned and run by the family itself. That slow, careful growth would remain the defining trait of the company for decades to come. But the family running it was about to change generations far sooner than anyone expected. Harry and Esther had 2 biological sons, Guy, born in 1951, and Rich, born in 1952, along with an adopted son named Wilbur, who the family began fostering as a young orphan in the early 1960s. The 2 brothers grew up almost entirely inside the family business, spending their childhoods helping out at the restaurants and at a local raceway their father partially owned. From early on, Guy and Rich showed very different temperaments, and that difference would shape the company's leadership for years afterward. Harry Snyder died of lung cancer on December 14, 1976, at the age of 63, leaving behind a chain of 18 restaurants built almost entirely through cash flow and careful reinvestment. Rich Snyder, only 24 years old at the time, immediately stepped into the role of company president. Rich pushed the chain into a new era, building out corporate infrastructure, launching an internal training program called In-N-Out University, and expanding the restaurant count well beyond what his father had built, while still holding firmly to the same insistence on fresh ingredients and hands-on quality control. Rich became known within the company for protecting the culture his parents had created, famously growing furious when a hired consultant once suggested the company could save money by cutting employee pay. That refusal to treat workers as an easy place to cut costs became one of the defining traits of the entire company, one that separated In-N-Out from nearly every other fast food chain of its size. Rich led the company through nearly 2 decades of steady growth, and by the early 1990s, the chain had become a genuine Southern California institution, known for a small, secret menu and a level of customer devotion competitors could not match. On February 22, 1993, Rich Snyder was killed in a plane crash near John Wayne Airport in Orange County. He was 40 years old, and his death left the company without the man who had led it for nearly 17 years. Since Rich had no children of his own, leadership of the company passed to his older brother Guy, who up until that point had lived a much quieter life outside of daily company operations. Guy Snyder took over as president following his brother's death, but his years at the helm were shorter and more difficult than Rich's had been. Guy struggled with substance abuse during parts of his adult life, and on December 15, 1999, he died from what was later reported as an accidental overdose involving prescription medication. He was 48 years old. His only child, a 17-year-old daughter named Lindsay, suddenly found herself as the last surviving direct descendant of Harry and Esther Snyder, and the eventual heir to a company generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year, though she was still far too young to take on any leadership role. With both of her sons gone, Esther Snyder stepped back into an active leadership position at the company she had co-founded more than 50 years earlier, guiding it through the years following Guy's death. Esther had never fully stepped away from the business, even during her son's years running it, having handled the books from the very first day the stand opened in 1948. Her steady presence held the company together during one of its most uncertain stretches, but her own health would not allow her to lead forever. In 2006, tension inside the family and the company surfaced publicly through a lawsuit. Rich Boyd, a longtime company executive and co-trustee overseeing a large portion of company stock, accused Lindsay Snyder and company vice president Mark Taylor of trying to push the elderly Esther Snyder out of the business against her wishes. Lindsay and Taylor strongly denied the accusations, and the company responded with its own lawsuit against Boyd, alleging he had misused company funds for personal construction projects and accepted uncompetitive bids from contractors. The dispute was settled out of court in May 2006, just months before Esther's death. Esther Snyder passed away on August 4, 2006, at the age of 86, leaving Lindsay as the sole surviving Snyder heir to the entire company. Because Lindsay was still in her 20s and had not yet taken on a senior leadership role, day-to-day operations were handed to Mark Taylor, a longtime company executive with close ties to the family, who became the first non-family president in company history. Lindsay spent the years that followed working through different departments of the company, including corporate merchandising, gradually preparing to take over the role her grandfather, uncle, father, and grandmother had each held before her. On January 1, 2010, Lindsay Snyder officially became the 6th president of In-N-Out Burger. At the time she took the role, she had already lived through the death of her uncle in a plane crash, the death of her father from an overdose, and the death of her grandmother, all before her 30th birthday. She inherited 50% ownership of the company outright on her 30th birthday in 2012, and received the remaining stake in full on her 35th birthday in 2017. Making her the sole owner of the entire company. Since taking over, Lindsay Snyder has expanded In-N-Out well beyond its traditional Southern California base, pushing the chain into Texas, Colorado, Tennessee, and other states far outside the region where the family had operated for generations. Under her leadership, the number of locations has nearly doubled, growing from under 250 stores to more than 400, while the company has continued to refuse both franchising and any form of outside investment or public stock offering. She has repeatedly stated that she has no intention of ever selling the company, framing that decision as tied directly to her Christian faith rather than pure business strategy. Lindsay has continued family traditions that predate her leadership, including printing short Bible verses on cups and food wrappers, a practice her Uncle Rich originally started decades earlier. She has also been notably private compared to many business leaders of her wealth and stature, rarely giving interviews for much of her early presidency, and citing 2 separate kidnapping attempts during her youth as part of the reason for her caution around public exposure. In more recent years, she has opened up somewhat, participating in interviews and eventually publishing a memoir detailing her family's history and her own personal struggles, including her battles with substance abuse following her father's death and the end of 3 earlier marriages before she eventually remarried. Despite her wealth and the size of the company she controls, Lindsay has kept much of her personal life away from the public spotlight, splitting her time between running the business and raising her children. She remains deeply involved in day-to-day decisions at the company, regularly attending store openings, employee training events, and company gatherings, rather than operating purely from a distance. That hands-on approach mirrors the same instinct her grandparents had when they were the only 2 employees running the original stand back in 1948. In-N-Out Burger remains entirely privately owned by Lindsay Snyder, with no public stock, no outside investors, and no franchise locations anywhere in the chain. According to recent wealth estimates, her personal fortune has been valued at more than $7 billion, making her one of the wealthiest self-made women in the country, even though her wealth came through inheritance rather than building the company from scratch herself. She has consistently ranked among the youngest female billionaires in American history since first appearing on wealth rankings in her early 30s. The company today operates more than 400 restaurants across 8 states, generating billions of dollars in annual revenue, while maintaining the same core menu of burgers, fries, and shakes that Harry and Esther served out of their original 10-foot wide stand. Every location still makes food fresh to order, rather than relying on frozen ingredients or heat lamps, a standard set by Harry Snyder more than 75 years ago that the company has never abandoned despite its growth far beyond California. Lindsay has said publicly that she has no plans to ever sell the company or take it public, and has stated her intention to eventually pass ownership down to her own children, continuing the same family control that has defined In-N-Out since its very first day. Given the losses the family has endured along the way, from a fatal plane crash to an untimely overdose, to a lawsuit that nearly fractured the company from within, that continued family ownership stands as one of the more remarkable through lines in modern American business history. This story does not move in a straight line from a tiny hamburger stand to a multi-billion-dollar company. It runs through a 2-way speaker box built by a Navy veteran who refused to sell anything but fresh ingredients. It runs through a plane crash that killed one brother at 40 and an overdose that killed the other at 48. Leaving a teenage girl as the last surviving heir to an empire she was nowhere near ready to run. It runs through a lawsuit that pitted loyal employees against family members during one of the company's most fragile moments, and a grandmother who stepped back into leadership twice after burying both of her sons. Every burger sold across more than 400 restaurants today traces back to a $5,000 hamburger stand built by 2 newlyweds in 1948, and to a granddaughter who inherited that stand as a grieving teenager and turned it into one of the most fiercely loyal brands in American fast food. Lindsay Snyder has said the decision to keep the company in family hands is not about the money, but about honoring what her grandparents built from nothing. More than 75 years after Harry and Esther Snyder opened their first stand across the street from a high school, the company they built is still owned entirely by their family, with no plan in sight to ever change that.